Some people say the frontier only remembers the strong, but that isn't always true. Sometimes the frontier remembers the ones who refuse to disappear. The wind moved slowly across the open desert that afternoon, dragging thin ribbons of dust over the red earth like a tired hand brushing away old footprints. Out here, nearly 40 miles from the nearest town and farther still from any proper road, the land belonged to silence, to hawks circling high above the mesas, and to the stubborn men and women who dared to cross it. Ethan Caldwell had been riding that lonely stretch of country since sunrise, his bay gelding picking a careful path between scattered rocks and patches of brittle sage. The sun hung low but fierce, the kind that baked the ground until the air shimmered like heat over a blacksmith's forge. Ethan was a rancher by trade and a quiet one by nature, a man who preferred the company of horses and open sky to the noise of towns where people talked too much about things they barely understood. He had learned a long time ago that the frontier was full of stories, but most of them were only half true. The horse slowed without being asked. That alone was enough to catch Ethan's attention. A good horse notices what a man might miss, and this one had just stopped as if the earth itself had spoken. Ethan leaned slightly in the saddle and followed the direction of the horse's ears. At first there was nothing but sunlit stone and long shadows stretching across the sand. Then he saw it, a shape where no shape should have been. Someone lay on the ground ahead, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of breath that was easy to miss unless you were looking carefully. Ethan guided the horse closer, the leather saddle creaking softly with each step. As the distance closed, the figure became clear. A young woman dressed in worn Apache warrior garments, her dark hair spread across the dust like spilled ink under the desert light. The marks of long travel clung to her clothes and face, but what held Ethan's attention was not the hardship written in those details. It was her eyes. They were open, clear, awake, watching him with the calm focus of someone who had already faced the worst the frontier could offer. She did not speak. She did not plead. The desert wind stirred the edges of her clothing, carrying with it the dry scent of sage and sun-warmed stone. Ethan dismounted slowly, boots touching the earth with the quiet caution of a man who understood how fragile moments like this could be. For a long second neither of them moved. Two strangers from two different worlds standing in the wide silence of the American West. Then the woman spoke, her voice steady despite the miles of dust behind it. "You should keep riding." Ethan looked at her, then at the empty horizon stretching in every direction for miles. Out here, a person could disappear without leaving so much as a whisper behind. He rested one hand on the saddle horn and studied the young Apache warrior again, noticing something else now, something that made the air around them feel heavier with meaning. The frontier was full of crossroads, but most men never realized when they were standing in one. Ethan Caldwell did. The wind shifted slightly as if the desert itself had leaned closer to listen. Ethan Caldwell stood beside his horse and studied the young Apache warrior with the patient stillness of a man who had spent most of his life reading land instead of words. He had crossed enough miles of open country to understand that silence often carried more truth than speech. The woman's gaze never left him. There was no fear in it, and no anger either. Only a quiet certainty that the path ahead had already been decided long before this meeting. Ethan rested his hat back against his head and looked across the empty horizon once more. Nothing moved out there except heat waves rising from the ground and a hawk drifting in slow circles nearly 1,000 feet above the valley floor. If anyone else had passed through this stretch of desert today, the land had already erased their tracks. He returned his attention to the woman. Up close he could see the calm discipline in the way she held herself, the straight line of her shoulders, the steady breathing that came from someone trained to endure long days under a harsh sun. Even here, lying on the open earth, she carried the quiet presence of a warrior. Ethan had seen that kind of composure before many years earlier when he had worn a soldier's coat. That never quite fit his spirit. He had left that life behind along with the noise and bitterness that followed it. These days he measured a man by simpler things. Whether he kept his word, whether he rode straight, whether he helped when help was needed. The woman's voice had been steady when she told him to keep riding, but Ethan noticed something she could not hide. The long miles of desert had taken their toll, and the journey ahead would demand more strength than anyone should face alone. He crouched beside her carefully, keeping his movements slow so that nothing about the moment felt like a threat. The horse behind him shifted its weight and lowered its head, as if sensing the gravity of the scene. Ethan spoke quietly, the way a rancher might speak to a nervous colt during its first ride. "You have been traveling for a long time." The woman watched him for a moment before answering. Her voice carried the faint accent of the Apache tongue, but her English was clear. "Long enough." Ethan nodded once. He did not ask where she had come from or why the desert had left her here. The frontier was full of stories that belonged to the people who carried them. Asking too many questions too soon was the quickest way to close a door that might otherwise open with patience. Instead, he glanced toward his saddle where a small canteen hung from a worn leather strap. The water inside had been measured carefully since sunrise. Out here, every drop mattered. Still, Ethan reached for it and loosened the cap before placing it within her reach. The woman hesitated only a moment before taking a small drink. Not the desperate gulp of someone chasing thirst, but the careful sip of someone who respected what the land demanded from those who traveled it. When she finished, she handed the canteen back. Ethan replaced the cap and studied the wide desert around them again. The sun had begun its slow fall toward the western ridges, painting the rock formations in long shadows the color of copper and rust. Night would come soon, and the desert after dark was not a place where anyone should remain alone. Ethan Caldwell had learned many lessons riding the frontier, but one truth stood above the rest. Sometimes a man does not choose the road in front of him. Sometimes the road chooses him. The desert was turning the color of old copper as the sun drifted lower behind the distant mesas. Ethan Caldwell stood beside his horse for another quiet moment, listening to the slow breathing of the young Apache warrior and the soft whisper of wind brushing across the dry grass. The frontier had a way of stretching a moment until it felt like a decision carved in stone. Out here there were no judges, no crowds, no second chances. A man either rode on or he stayed. Ethan had already made his choice, even if he had not spoken it aloud. He walked back to his horse and loosened the bedroll that hung behind the saddle. The leather straps creaked softly as he worked. The woman watched him carefully, her sharp eyes following every movement the way a scout watches a stranger entering unfamiliar land. Ethan spread the canvas roll across the ground and adjusted it with steady hands. The act itself was simple, the kind of work a rancher had done 1,000 times when tending to an injured calf or helping a tired rider after a long day in the saddle. But this moment carried a different weight. When he finished, he looked toward her again. The sun caught the edges of her dark hair and turned it almost bronze in the evening light. For a moment, the desert seemed to hold its breath. Ethan spoke quietly. "Night will reach this valley in less than an hour. The temperature will drop fast once the sun disappears behind those hills." The woman followed his gaze toward the western ridge line where the shadows had begun to stretch longer across the sand. She understood the land well enough to know he was telling the truth. The desert after dark could be as cold as it was unforgiving. She studied him again with that same calm expression she had shown since he arrived. "You should still keep riding," she said. Ethan shook his head slightly. A man who leaves someone behind out here does not sleep well afterward. The woman held his gaze, searching for something in his words that might reveal a hidden motive, but Ethan Caldwell had lived long enough among open skies to know how to speak plainly. There was nothing in his voice except quiet resolve. He stepped forward carefully and positioned the bedroll closer beside her. The horse behind him shifted its hooves against the sand and let out a slow breath. Ethan noticed the way the woman's eyes followed the movement of the animal. Even in her condition, she still carried the awareness of a warrior trained to observe everything around her. Ethan gave a small nod toward the saddle. "My ranch is a little more than 12 miles north of here. If we travel steady, we can reach the river before midnight. The water there stays warm enough to keep the cold away." The woman remained silent for several seconds. The wind lifted a strand of her hair and carried it lightly across her face. At last she spoke again. "Why would you help me?" Ethan looked out across the desert one more time as if the land itself might answer for him. Then he turned back and met her steady gaze. "Because sometimes the frontier tests a man not with enemies, but with choices." The sky above them had begun to fade from bright gold to the deeper blue that comes just before dusk. Far off along the ridgeline, the hawk that had been circling earlier folded its wings and disappeared behind the cliffs. Ethan Caldwell stepped closer and reached for the edge of the bedroll. The road ahead would not be easy, but the frontier had already decided that their paths would not end here. The last light of the sun slipped behind the western ridge, and the desert slowly began to cool, the heat draining from the sand as evening settled over the wide valley. Ethan Caldwell moved with quiet purpose, the steady rhythm of a man who had spent most of his life working under open skies where every task depended on patience and careful hands. He knelt beside the bedroll and adjusted the canvas so that it would hold firm once tied behind the saddle. The young Apache warrior watched him without speaking, her eyes following the small details of his work the same way a tracker studies the ground for hidden signs. Nothing about Ethan's movements suggested hurry or doubt. He worked slowly, making sure each knot would hold through miles of uneven ground. When he finished, he looked toward her again and spoke in the calm tone he might use with a frightened animal or a tired traveler. "This will not be comfortable, but it will carry you." The woman studied the canvas for a moment and then looked back at him. Her expression remained composed, though the long day had begun to show in the slight heaviness of her breathing. "You take a risk for someone you do not know," she said quietly. Ethan lifted one shoulder in a small shrug. "Out here, most people start as strangers." The horse stepped closer, as if sensing it was time to move. Ethan rested a hand against the animal's neck and murmured softly before guiding it into position beside the bedroll. The desert around them had grown quieter now. The wind that had whispered through the valley earlier was fading, replaced by the distant call of a night bird somewhere among the rocks. Above them, the sky was turning a deep shade of blue that comes just before the first stars appear. Ethan turned back toward the woman and crouched carefully. "If we travel steady, we will reach the river in 3 hours, he said. "The ground between here and there is mostly open, but there are some narrow trails where the rocks tighten." The woman listened closely. Her calm gaze never left his face. Finally, she nodded once. A small gesture that carried the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to making difficult choices without hesitation. Ethan slid one arm beneath her shoulders and carefully shifted her onto the canvas roll. He moved slowly, giving her time to adjust as the weight of the journey ahead settled between them. The horse shifted again but remained steady, trained well enough to trust the man holding the reins. When Ethan finished securing the bedroll behind the saddle, he stepped back and checked the straps once more. Everything held firm. The last edge of sunlight disappeared beyond the ridge, and the desert cooled another few degrees. Ethan placed his hat back on his head and gathered the reins. The woman looked toward the darkening horizon where the faint outline of distant hills marked the direction he had chosen. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said quietly, "My name is Ayanna." Ethan gave a small nod as he mounted the saddle. "Ethan Caldwell," he replied. The horse began walking north at a slow and steady pace, its hooves pressing soft prints into the cooling sand. Above them, the first stars appeared one by one across the wide western sky, and the long road toward the river opened ahead like a quiet promise carried by the night. The desert night settled slowly across the valley as Ethan Caldwell guided his horse along the narrow path that wound between scattered rocks and low desert brush. The temperature had already dropped nearly 20 degrees since sunset, and the dry air carried the cool, sharp scent of sage and dust that always rose when the heat finally released its grip on the land. The horse moved carefully, its hooves pressing quiet prints into the pale sand while the stars above grew brighter with every passing mile. Ayanna lay secured behind the saddle within the canvas bedroll, her eyes open as she watched the sky stretch endlessly overhead. The rhythm of the horse's movement carried them north across the empty land, steady and unhurried. Ethan rode with the quiet focus of someone who had spent years crossing long distances under starlight, guiding his horse by memory as much as by sight. The moon had not yet risen, but the stars provided enough light for a man who understood the shape of the country. After nearly an hour of travel, the land began to change. The open valley narrowed into a stretch of stone ridges that rose like dark walls on either side of the trail. The wind slipped through the rock formations with a low whisper that echoed across the canyon floor. Ethan slowed the horse slightly as they entered the passage, letting the animal choose its steps carefully over the uneven ground. Behind him, he heard Ayanna shift slightly within the bedroll. "You ride this trail often," she said quietly. Ethan kept his eyes on the path ahead. "Often enough to know where the ground tries to trick you." The canyon walls blocked the wind, and the air grew still around them. Above, a narrow ribbon of sky revealed thousands of stars scattered across the darkness. Ayana watched them in silence for a while before speaking again. You are not afraid of what might follow you. Ethan considered the question for a moment before answering. Fear is common on the frontier. What matters is whether a man lets it decide his direction. The horse continued forward through the narrow stone passage, its breath forming faint clouds in the cool air. Somewhere far above, an owl called once and then disappeared into the darkness. The sound echoed softly through the canyon before fading into silence again. After another mile, the rocky walls opened back into open desert, and the distant shape of cottonwood trees appeared on the horizon like a shadow against the sky. Ethan pointed ahead. The river is there. Ayana followed his gaze. Even in the darkness, she could see the faint movement of water reflecting the starlight. They continued riding until the ground softened beneath the horse's hooves, and the quiet sound of flowing water reached their ears. Ethan guided the horse toward the edge of the riverbank where the cottonwood trees formed a small shelter from the night wind. When he finally stopped the horse, he dismounted slowly and loosened the bedroll straps. The river moved steadily beside them, its surface reflecting the stars like scattered silver across the water. For the first time since they began the journey, Ethan allowed himself a long breath. The hardest miles were behind them. But as he helped Ayana settle beside the riverbank, he knew that the road ahead would ask far more than distance alone. The river moved quietly beside the cottonwood trees, its steady current reflecting the cold shimmer of starlight as the night deepened across the valley. Ethan Caldwell worked carefully near the bank, gathering a few fallen branches and dry twigs that had collected beneath the trees. Within minutes, a small fire began to glow, its warm light pushing back the darkness just enough to make the narrow patch of ground feel less lonely beneath the endless sky. The horse stood nearby, lowering its head to drink from the river, while the quiet sound of flowing water blended with the soft crackle of the fire. Ayana rested on the bedroll Ethan had spread beside the flames, her eyes watching the shifting light as it moved across the cottonwood trunks. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The frontier often allowed silence to say more than words. Ethan filled a small metal cup from the river and placed it near the edge of the fire so the water could warm. The steam rose slowly into the cool night air. After a few minutes, he brought the cup to her and helped her sit slightly upright. She accepted the warm water with steady hands and drank slowly. Even that simple act seemed to bring some color back to her face. Ethan returned to the fire and adjusted one of the branches, sending a brief shower of sparks upward into the dark sky. Above them, the stars had multiplied until the heavens looked almost crowded with light. After a while, Ayana spoke, her voice quiet but clear in the still night. Your land is far from the towns of your people. Ethan nodded once while watching the flames. That is the way I prefer it. Towns bring noise. The land brings clarity. She studied him across the firelight. Most men who wear your hat would not stop for someone like me. Ethan met her gaze for a moment, and then looked back toward the river. The frontier has many kinds of men. Some ride for profit. Some ride for pride. A few simply ride because it is the right road in front of them. The fire popped softly as another branch settled into the embers. Ayana looked toward the dark hills that surrounded the valley. Somewhere beyond those ridges lay the territory of her people, but tonight the distance between those worlds felt larger than the miles themselves. She turned back toward Ethan. My father is a chief among our people, she said quietly. Ethan did not appear surprised. The way you carry yourself suggested something like that. A faint smile touched the corner of her mouth before fading again. My people will search for me. Ethan leaned back slightly, resting his hands against the ground beside him. The stars reflected in the slow water of the river behind him. I imagine they will. The night breeze moved gently through the cottonwood leaves, producing a low whisper that sounded almost like distant voices carried across the valley. For a long moment, both of them listened to that sound. Finally, Ayana spoke again. When they find you with me, they may not understand what happened here. Ethan placed another branch onto the fire and watched the flames grow slightly brighter. Understanding has never been the frontier's strongest skill, he said calmly. The river continued its steady path through the valley as the firelight flickered against the trees, and somewhere in the distance the faint echo of hoofbeats carried briefly across the night wind before fading back into silence. The sound reached Ethan Caldwell before the wind carried it clearly across the valley. It was faint. At first, little more than a distant rhythm against the quiet of the night. But a man who had spent years riding open country learned to recognize certain sounds long before they grew loud. Hoofbeats. Several horses moving together somewhere beyond the ridges. Ethan lifted his head slightly and listened without moving. The fire beside him crackled softly, sending thin sparks drifting into the cool air beneath the cottonwood branches. The river continued its steady flow beside the camp, but now another rhythm had joined the night. Across the firelight, Ayana had heard it too. Her eyes turned toward the dark hills beyond the riverbank. "They ride well," she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. The riders were still distant, but their pace suggested men who knew exactly where they were going. The frontier had many sounds, but the sound of determined riders was rarely mistaken. Ethan stood slowly and walked a few steps toward the edge of the riverbank where the ground rose slightly above the trees. From there he could see farther across the open desert beyond the valley. The night sky had grown clear and bright with stars, giving just enough light to reveal movement on the distant ridge. Small shapes appeared along the horizon. Riders. Several of them. They moved in a long, silent line across the ridge before turning toward the river valley below. Ethan counted without speaking. 10. Then 15. Perhaps more behind them, still hidden by the darkness. He returned to the fire and placed another branch into the embers. The flames rose briefly before settling again. Ayana watched him carefully. "You are calm," she said. Ethan lowered himself back onto the ground beside the fire. Riders crossing this land at night usually have a reason. Panic rarely improves the conversation that follows. The hoofbeats grew louder now, echoing faintly against the stone ridges surrounding the valley. The horse standing near the cottonwood tree lifted its head and turned its ears toward the approaching sound, but remained steady beside the camp. Ethan rested his hands loosely on his knees while watching the dark line of riders descending toward the river. They came without shouting, without the reckless speed of men looking for trouble. Their formation held steady, their pace controlled. Warriors who knew the land. Within a few minutes, the first riders appeared between the trees at the edge of the riverbank. Moonlight had begun to rise above the eastern hills, casting a pale glow across the valley floor. The light revealed tall figures mounted on strong horses, their silhouettes moving with quiet confidence through the shadows. They stopped about 40 yards from the fire. No weapons were raised. No voices broke the silence. They simply waited. Ayana studied them carefully, her sharp eyes recognizing the patterns painted across their clothing and the familiar posture of riders from her own people. Ethan Caldwell remained seated beside the fire, the warm glow reflecting softly against the brim of his hat. After a moment, one of the riders stepped forward from the line. He was older than the others, his posture straight and composed in the saddle. His gaze moved first to Ayana resting beside the fire, then slowly to the quiet cowboy sitting across from her. For several seconds the valley held nothing but the sound of the river and the low crackle of burning wood. Finally the rider spoke, his voice steady as the desert wind. "We have been searching for her since the sun rose yesterday." Ayana lifted her chin slightly and met his gaze across the firelight. "And now you have found me." The night air held perfectly still as the older rider guided his horse a few steps closer to the firelight. The pale moon rising behind the eastern hills now cast enough light across the valley to reveal the faces of the warriors waiting among the cottonwood trees. Their horses stood calm and disciplined, their riders silent as carved stone. Ethan Caldwell remained seated beside the fire, the orange glow reflecting faintly against the brim of his hat. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not stand. He simply watched the moment unfold with the steady patience of a man who understood that the frontier often tested character more than courage. The older warrior's eyes rested on Ayana again. For a moment the strength in his posture seemed to soften, though his voice remained firm when he spoke. "We feared the desert had taken you." Ayana lifted her head slightly, and the firelight caught the quiet determination in her expression. "The desert did not take me." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had happened since the sun rose the day before. The older rider's gaze moved slowly toward Ethan. The silence between them lasted long enough for the river to fill the valley with its steady whisper. Finally he asked the question that had been waiting since the riders arrived. "This man brought you here?" Ayana followed his glance toward the cowboy seated across the fire. "Yes," she said. Ethan Caldwell did not interrupt. He simply added another small branch to the fire and let the flames rise gently before settling again. The older warrior studied him carefully. The Apache riders behind him remained still, their eyes moving between the two figures beside the fire. The leader spoke again. Many men would have left her where the desert placed her. Ethan answered calmly. The desert already had enough silence without adding another life to it. The older rider considered those words. The wind stirred lightly through the cottonwood leaves above them, sending a soft rustle through the branches. Ayanna shifted slightly on the bedroll and faced the riders more directly. He carried me across 12 miles of desert, she said. He gave water when the sun burned the ground. He rode through the canyon after nightfall so that I would not remain alone beneath the cold sky. The riders listened without speaking. The firelight flickered across their faces as the moon climbed higher above the valley. Finally, the older warrior dismounted from his horse. The quiet movement drew every eye toward him as his boots touched the ground beside the riverbank. He walked slowly toward the fire until he stood only a few steps away from Ethan Caldwell. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he reached down and placed a small carved object beside the edge of the firelight. It was a simple piece of polished stone tied with braided leather, the symbol of a promise among his people. Ethan glanced at it, and then looked up at the man standing across from him. The older warrior spoke with calm certainty. The frontier remembers men who choose the difficult road. Tonight my people remember you. The river continued its slow and steady journey through the valley as the moon climbed higher into the open sky, washing the cottonwood trees in a pale silver light. The fire had settled into a bed of glowing embers, its warmth drifting gently through the cool desert air. Ethan Caldwell remained seated beside the fading flames while the older Apache warrior stood across from him, the small carved stone resting between them in the sand. Around the clearing the riders remained silent, their horses calm and patient as if they understood that this moment required stillness rather than movement. For a long while no one spoke. The river filled the quiet with its constant whisper while the leaves above stirred softly in the night breeze. Ayanna watched both men with steady eyes. The journey across the desert had drained her strength, but not her spirit. The firelight reflected in her gaze as she studied the warrior who had stepped forward from the riders. At last the older man turned toward her. His voice softened slightly when he spoke again. Your father has not slept since the sun set yesterday. Every rider who could travel has searched the valleys and the ridges. Ayanna lowered her eyes briefly as if picturing the distant camp where her people waited. Then she looked back toward the fire. I knew they would come. The older warrior nodded slowly before turning again to Ethan Caldwell. There was no hostility in his expression now, only the careful respect of a man measuring another's character. Among my people a life carried across the desert is never forgotten, he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of tradition older than the frontier itself. Ethan glanced once more at the carved stone placed beside the fire. The leather cord tied around it caught the moonlight faintly. He understood enough of the frontier to recognize when a gesture carried meaning beyond words. Still he spoke with the same quiet tone he had used since the night began. She would have done the same for anyone who needed help. The older warrior studied him for a moment before a faint smile touched the edge of his weathered face. Perhaps, he said, but not every man would have done the same for her. The river wind moved softly across the clearing and carried the smell of water and cottonwood leaves through the night. One of the riders brought his horse forward and stopped beside Ayanna. Another dismounted and carefully prepared a saddle blanket so she could travel more comfortably when they returned to their people. The movements were quiet and respectful, performed without urgency now that the long search had ended. Before the riders lifted her, Ayanna turned once more toward Ethan. The firelight had nearly faded, leaving only a soft red glow across the sand between them. For a moment she said nothing. Then she spoke quietly so that only he could hear. The desert may forget many things, but my people will not forget this road. Ethan gave a small nod, the kind a rancher might give after finishing a long day's work. That is enough for me, he replied. Soon the riders began their slow departure beneath the wide western sky. The sound of hooves moved gradually away from the river valley until it blended once again with the quiet breath of the desert night. Ethan Caldwell remained beside the dying fire, watching the stars above the cottonwood trees. Out here the frontier kept its own record of men and choices. And sometimes the truest kind of justice arrived not with noise, but with a quiet memory carried across the open land.